Hi, chess friends. My name is Yuvanshu Agarwal, but feel free to call me UV for short, and welcome to my channel. To give you a little bit about me, I've been playing chess for the past 9 years now and have an elo close to 2100, and I pretty much love this game. So for today's video, this is going to be the first video part of a video series dedicated to understanding positional exercises offered by Grandmaster Jacob Aagard in his book, Excelling at Positional Chess. And so I'm going to be walking through with you my thinking process, how I process the position, and we'll be going through some of the solutions. So let's get to it. All right, guys, so here is our first position. This position is white to move. Playing as white here, we have Andersson, and playing as black here, we have Aagaard. This match was held in Skellefteå, Sweden in 1989. And so what I would recommend is just taking 10 to 15 minutes to try to understand the position. Just pause that video, understand the position, try to see if you can find out the best sequence of moves for white here. And then once you feel confident in your answer, unpause that video, and then I will lead you through my thought process and the solution. All right, so I'm assuming that you paused the video, taken a look at the position, and have some idea or solution of what's going on. Well, then let's get to it. The first thing I would do when I'm analyzing a position is always try to understand the material imbalance, right? It's the easiest first step. And what you can see here is that white has 7 pawns, black has 7 pawns, white has 2 bishops and 1 knight, black has 2 knights and 1 bishop. White has a queen for a queen, black's got the 2 rooks, white's got the 2 rooks, and of course they both have kings. So what we can tell right off the bat is that both sides have equal material, except for the fact that white has both bishops and black does not. That's step number 1. Now that we've understood the material imbalance, we can start to understand what each of the pieces on each side of the board are actually trying to do. Because I believe that it's important to look at each piece in turn so you can understand what its individual strengths and weaknesses are in the position. Start off, let's look at black. Black's knight on e6 is controlling the valuable d4 square. If you look at the bishop on g7, it's doing just that as well, controlling this valuable d4 square and exerting pressure along this long diagonal. The pawn on c5 also helps with that as well. So it's quite clear to note here that black has very strong control over the d4 square. Now, what about this knight on d7? What is it doing? And that's a really great question because I frankly do not know. This knight is very, very passive in this position, and it certainly can be improved. If you look at some of the squares it can go to, like e5 or f6, black would not really want to move that knight to these squares because it's just going to block in that bishop on g7 from controlling the d4 square. So the knight on d7 is definitely a piece we need to look to improve in the future. Now let's look at some of black's major pieces. So if we look at the queen on b8, it's definitely blocked in by this pawn on d6, right? And another great indicator that it's quite a passive piece is that it's on the back rank. It's not really doing anything. It's not contributing to any one of black's goals. It's also blocking in the rook on a8, which has no open file and is struggling for any activity at the moment. Now, aside from the rook on a8, the rook on f8 can also be improved, potentially by moving it to d8, where it can potentially defend the d6 square, or excuse me, the d6 pawn. Now, speaking of weak pawns, once we've understood each of the pieces in black's position and what they're trying to do, let's take a look at black's pawn structure. So the d6 pawn is definitely one of black's main pawn weaknesses. It's a glaring weakness right off the bat, and it's a bigger weakness because of the fact that white's queen can directly attack the pawn on d6. Aside from that, and aside from pawn weaknesses, it's also important to start to see if black has any square weaknesses. The d5 square is a square that white controls tremendously with the knight on c3, the pawn on c4, and the pawn on d5. This is black's critical weakness as well. Now, when I look at piece weaknesses, I also try to see certain points of attack for my other opponents to attack them through with their own pieces. So this knight on c3 can clearly go to b5 and then attack the pawn on d6. So it would make sense for black to, in the future, guard against this square. Now that we've understood black's side and their pieces and their pawn structure, what is some of the plans that black would like to implement to help improve their position? Well, like we mentioned, the knight on d7 is quite passive, the queen on b8 is passive, and so is the rook on a8. And so one of black's plans in this position could be to potentially try to open up themselves on the queen side by either playing a6, followed by playing b5, and allowing this knight to potentially go to b6 so it can start to put pressure on c4. This seems to be black's best plan in the position, hopefully opening up the a files and putting pressure on white's queen side. Now that we've completely finished our analysis of what black's pieces and their plans are, let's take a look at white. So starting with their pieces, the bishop on e3 is doing a great job defending the d4 square, right? It's definitely well placed as d4 seems to be the central square of the battle struggle. Knight on c3 is also well placed in this position as it's controlling the d5 square along with these two pawns. Now, aside from the knight and the bishop on e2 may seem a little bit questionable, as you can tell that the pawn on c4 is restricting its movement, but even this piece is well placed, as it can potentially go to squares like g4, or if white has ideas of playing something like f4 followed by playing f5, the bishop can also move to f3. Aside from white's minor pieces, if we take a look at white's major pieces, we can start with this rook on f1. This rook on f1 is directly behind the pawn on f2, which is looking to move to f4 and f5. Due to this pawn advance, it makes sense for the white rook to stay on f1, so we can tell that it's well placed. What about this queen on d1? Well, it makes sense to put the queen on d1 because it's directly attacking one of our direct pawn weaknesses. That brings us to our final piece, the rook on c1. Now, the rook on c1 doesn't seem to be doing anything at the moment. It's blocked in by the knight and the pawn on c4. And as we mentioned, it's clear to us that black's main pawn weakness here is d6. So is there any way that white can somehow improve the position of this rook so that it can apply more pressure to black's major weakness on d6? If you thought of rook to c2, then you're absolutely correct. Rook to c2 is a beautiful move in this position, with the idea of playing rook to d2 to apply pressure on the d file. That's actually what occurs in the game between Andersson and Aagaard, and here black plays a6. a6 makes sense as it's continuing to defend the b5 square against the knight on b5, and it's continuing to help black push for b5 on their own. White continues, of course, with rook to d2, attacking the pawn on d6, and black plays knight to d4. Black is trying to leverage their extremely strong control over the d4 square in order to block white's d-file. Now, white has a critical decision to make. Are they just going to sit back and allow black to control the d4 square, or are they going to try to open up the d-file? And as soon as white plays bishop takes d4, black plays bishop takes d4, white plays an extremely killer move in this position, rook takes d4. Boom. After pawn takes d4, queen takes d4, just look at that position. Pawn on d6 is definitely going to be lost within the next few moves. The queen on d4 has complete control over the d4 square, right? Look at the long diagonals that it currently possesses, very centralized and active queen. The knight on c3 is directly hopping onto d5, all right? And of course, d5 square control is very strong. We also have potential ideas of f4, if need be, to control the e5 square. In short, white has a lot of pressure in this position. And it's definitely clear to us that this exchange sacrifice was well worth it. After queen to a7, this is black's best move and it was played in the game. Black is basically trying to get white to either exchange the queen or simply take the pawn, for which black can try to gain some sort of activity on the d file for. White continues by taking the pawn on d6, and black, of course, plays rook a to d8, getting their rook on the d file, ready to potentially attack the queen with the discovered attack on d6. White plays knight to d5. Just look at white's activity in this position. The queen on d6, the knight on d5, right? All of these are hammering through, ready to start to infiltrate black's king side, as you can see with e7, f6 square holding down, right? If you look at black's pieces, they're definitely tied down here. This knight on d7, what exactly is it doing, right? It's trying to defend the f6 square, right? But that's literally it. It also holds certain key squares such as c5 and e5, which may be useful later, but it's definitely quite passive, and it's quite clear to see that white's queen and knight are definitely driving home a very strong attack. Now black plays king g7. I think I can understand the motivation here is to try to protect the f6 square, but a better option might have been to play something like queen to c5. Queen to c5. Directly attacking the white queen on d6, trying to exchange off these queens because white's attack is just too strong. Now, if white does exchange off the queens with queen takes c5, knight takes c5, black will directly attack the pawn on e4. However, after white plays f3, I think we can clearly see that white has the advantage in this endgame. A very strong knight on d5, as well as a strong pawn center, gives white the edge. Now, if white doesn't exchange off queens after queen to c5 and plays something like queen to g3, well, this could actually give black important counterplay after black plays queen to d4, effectively attacking e4 and gaining control of the d4 square and soon to be the e5 square. In the game, as I mentioned, black plays king to g7 and white simply follows up with rook to d1. And at this point, rook to d1 puts the final nail in the coffin. You can see that white has tremendous pressure along this strong d file of his. And this knight on d5 is, of course, attacking critical squares such as c7 and e7. And it is no surprise that just a few moves later, Andersson does go on to claim the victory. And that is all. Now, if you enjoyed this exercise, stay tuned for our next exercise, exercise number 2 in Excelling at Positional Chess by Grandmaster Jacob Aagard. And until then, I wish you the best on your chess journey, and I hope you continue to improve your positional chess.